Outside again. Yeah, I'm outside again. Doing another reaction. This time is a new, original, special thing called multi-reactions, where I put reaction videos in a playlist, and eventually, if I ever get my videos verified, I'm gonna make them all one video. So, let's do this. Yeah, cops.
Till finally it worked one time when I used a smaller cube, but after that it kept crashing, so I decided, alright, the water's just going on top of the beach now. And you know, technically I'm not wrong. I continued modeling the rest of the ponds and the lakes, and one of the rivers. I decided to save this river until later, and you'll see why when I get back to it. At this point, I decided to start modeling the brown rock structures that cover pretty much the rest of the map. The reason why I held off on doing this is because of all the ladders that change the elevation everywhere. There are some inconsistencies with the logic of the ladders. For example, down here there's a ladder that goes up, which should mean that everything from here on should be higher than the rest of the map. But continuing on from there, there's one more ladder that leads up to another point that's even higher. But right next to that is one ladder that returns back to the ground level. It doesn't make sense for two ladders to reach the same height as just one ladder, so that must mean that somewhere along the way the ground itself went down. There were a few places where I had to put ramps to change the elevation to match up with the ladders. The first spot is right here where I made a downwards ramp, and one is over here alongside the river, which is why I decided to hold off on that river. From here on, I just did a bunch of modeling to create the brown rock structures, and I gradually made the height increase as you go back, because I'm pretty sure this area is supposed to be Death Mountain. I also finished modeling the river, all the way up to the top, past the waterfall, where there's a little pond. It's also worth noting that there's a secret in the top right corner of the map. In the original game, there's actually an invisible path leading up to a higher area, so I replicated this by turning off collisions on one of the blocks so that you can reach the ladder. Now if you zoom out, it looks like pretty much everything on the map is complete, except for two areas with white rock structures over here and over here. I made one more texture for the white rock and completely made the outlines for these last two 3D models.
One of these days
there are
when I
also two rows
visit
of
your
white bushes,
house,
so I had to go and change
you're
to a new
gonna
color
see
palette for the bushes
me
to create a new material.
vlogging.
And then, since this is a graveyard, I had
That
to make
will
new models for the
be me
gravestones.
needing
I
to
also had to create
actually,
new
you
material to make the
know,
ground into a
change
gray color in
another
these areas. At this
intro.
point, if you zoom out, it looks like
But
the
this
map
one's
is
not
complete,
gonna have
and now I
hard
just had
metal
to
in
create
it.
a
It's
bunch
gonna
of
have
props to put on the
movie
finishing
music.
touches. Other than the bushes and the snail rocks, there are
Gonna have
various
quote
other props that
unquote
fill out the world,
cutie music.
one of which is these suits of armor that when touched actually turn into an enemy, but we'll get to that part later. At first I thought I could just use the model that I made for Link and swap on a new head to create the suit of armor, but it actually ended up being a bit more involved since the armor is actually thicker than Link is. Then I started making a model for the trees, and I realized while modeling the trees that the big tree dungeon entrances reused the same models except with a face in between, and it was a pretty similar process for making the other dungeon entrances and the obelisks. Then I placed these models in various places on the map, and turned off collisions on the openings so that Link could walk through them. I also realized that there are actually a few different versions of the dungeon entrances, one that has one eye, one that has two eyes, and one really large one that repeats the one eye texture twice. The final piece of the map that I had left was this desert area here that uses different textures for the floor. And with that, the entire map was now finished. I decided to take a quick stroll through the world that I recreated, but then I quickly got back to work after realizing that this is basically just a glorified walking simulator. At this point, I wanted to start adding the enemies, so I took a look at all the enemies that appear in the overworld, and it was really confusing with one enemy in particular. Apparently, the rock is an enemy because it falls down the screen and can hurt Link. And
oh, good. By the way, in this series, you will be tortured with me. No more me doing this. Just for this one video. Okay, maybe you don't have to sit through this one. This one is notorious.
Anyways, the first enemy that I started modeling was the Octoroks. It took me a few attempts to get something that I liked. The first few times were either too tall or too boxy looking. Finally, I made something decent, and then moved the legs to create the second version to create the animation. And as with pretty much every enemy in the game, there's also a blue version of the Octorok. The next thing I did was edit the suits of armor to create the Armos enemy. Bumping into the armor suits will activate them, and turn them into an Armos. And then I made the Tektites who have a pretty familiar animation cycle. For the next few enemies, I used a similar method to create the 3D models. First, I would create the 2D sprite from the front, and then create the 2D sprite from the side. Then I would lay them on top of each other, and start building off of that. This was the strategy I used to make the Lionels and the Moblins. And I could also do something similar for the Levers and the P-heads. Also, for the Moblins, I decided to give them the third animation frame similar to Link because it looked weird without it. And the Levers and P-heads don't have any animation, they just spin. Similarly, the Genie and the Zora only have one animation frame as well for some reason. With all of the enemy models finished, it was time to start making AI to make them move. And this was actually my first attempt at creating an AI. And while it works, it's probably the dumbest solution I could have come up with. So I gave it the appropriate name of Artificial Unintelligence, or ANI for short. Basically, I looked at how the enemies moved in the original game, and to me it looked like they just moved around randomly. So I decided to make a script that does exactly that. It works based off of randomly generated timers and randomly generated actions. By default, the enemy will start moving forward. Then it will create a random timer and randomly pick a number between 0 and 4. Each number represents a different action, like rotating a specific direction or deciding to stop, and when the timer ends, it will perform that action. If it stops, it does the exact same thing, except that the stopping action is replaced with a go action, and it also has the ability to shoot a projectile while stopped. It's such a brute force method, but it looks pretty convincing, so I'm not complaining. But this specific script only works for the Octoroks, the Moblins, and the Lionels. I had to create different variations for the other enemies. I made a similar script for the Levers and the Beeheads. When the script for them stops, they start to move down. The Levers will burrow underground, and the Beeheads will stop spinning and land on the ground. Then I had to make another similar script as the first one for the Genie and the Armos. The only difference is that these enemies don't stop moving. Now for the Tektites, I had to write a completely new script because they have a unique movement pattern. I still applied the same logic though. Create a random timer, and when that timer ends, pick a random direction and jump. The last enemy script I made was for the Zoras. It combines elements from the first two scripts because these enemies shoot projectiles and they also randomly move below the water. The only new thing I had to add here was a trigger around the Zora, and once the player enters this trigger, the Zora will start facing in that direction. And with that, the enemies are now finished, so it's time for me to start making the items. First I gave Link the ability to get the upgraded sword. The wooden sword can be obtained from an old man in the cave at the beginning of the game. The white sword can be obtained from an old man in the cave near the top of the map, and it will do twice as much damage as the wooden sword. And finally, the magical sword can be obtained from an old man who lives beneath a grave in the graveyard. All of these swords also have the ability to shoot out a sword beam if Link has full health, and it will explode into 4 pieces on contact. I made a script that will change the material of the sword every few frames to give it the same look from the original game. Then I modeled the bow and 2 different arrow types since they function almost identically to the sword beam. The only difference between the normal arrows and the silver arrows is that the silver arrow does twice as much damage and is also needed to defeat Ganon. Next, I created a magical rod because it also uses the same projectile mechanic. It creates a beam that will do the same amount of damage as the white sword, and if Link gets the Book of Magic item, the beam will create a fireball when it makes contact with anything. The next item was simple because as far as I can tell, the only purpose of the flute was to drain the water level and reveal the entrance to the level 7. To create the boomerang, I just modified the projectile script so that it'll come back to Link after a short period of time, and for the magical boomerang, that period of time is slightly longer. The blue candle and the red candle will spawn fireballs, and while the blue candle can only spawn 1, the red candle can spawn them infinitely, enough to make me fear that my computer will crash. But these fireballs can also reveal secret entrances. The power bracelet lets you move certain objects, some of which reveal secret entrances. The bombs can be placed, and after exploding will create some smoke effects, and if placed in the correct spots will also reveal secret entrances. There are a lot of secrets in this game, but at least it's a secret to everybody. Obtaining the letter from the old man in a cave at the top of the map will allow Link to purchase potions from any of the old ladies. The blue life potions will restore your health once, and the red second potions will restore your health once, and then turn into a blue life potion. But to be able to purchase these potions, we need to get rupees first. So I made the rupees into a random drop from enemies. The one that flickers between yellow and blue is worth 1 rupee, while the blue one is worth 5 rupees. I also made it so that the enemies can randomly drop hearts, which will restore Link's health. The other 2 random drops that enemies may spawn are clocks, which will slow down all of the enemies and make Link invincible for a short time, and the fairies, which will completely restore Link's health. Then there's the heart container that will increase Link's health by 1 heart. And then there's the items that are used automatically in certain situations. The raft will allow Link to sail on water as long as he walks off of a dock, and a stepladder will allow Link to walk across gaps that he was previously unable to. Or you can use the stepladder to perform some trick shots Call of Duty style. The shield by default will block some projectiles, but getting the magical shield will block Link from all projectiles. And finally, the blue ring and the red ring will change the color of Link's clothes, as well as increase his defense. The blue ring will double Link's defense, and the red ring will double it again. After finishing the items, I got to work on adding the UI. I tried to replicate the look of the original with a black bar across the top, but it felt like it took away from the game, so I lowered the opacity on it. Then I just did everything exactly the same, except for the number of keys. The sword box will show the strongest sword that you have, and the item box will show your currently equipped item. Pressing Q and E will swap between all the items in your inventory. Then I made a simple counter for the number of rupees and bombs that Link currently has. I didn't mention this earlier, but Link will obviously lose rupees whenever he goes to a shop, but he will also lose 1 rupee per arrow that he shoots. And normally in Zelda games, Link has 20 hearts, but in this game he only has 16. And he also doesn't get quarters of a heart, because it only displays hearts in halves. The final thing I did for the UI was creating the minimap. I had to do some math to convert Link's position in world space to a position on screen space. And with that, it will now track Link's position on the map. If I wanted to, I could easily swap out this blank map with a full map, but I'm not sure if the original had anything like that. And now it looks like the game is done, but now it's actually just an even more glorified walking simulator than it was before. Link still can't damage enemies, and they can't damage him either. I got to work on making it so that attacks will damage the player and the enemies, and it also made it so that when anyone receives damage, they have a knockback force applied to them and start changing color for a brief period of time. When testing this knockback feature, I binded it to a button at first to test if it was working properly, and accidentally made a really cool speedrunning mechanic similar to the ones found in other Zelda games. Then the last thing I did was make it so that running out of health will create a death explosion effect, and with that, the entire overworld is now finished.
Yeah, that means that this one will have an intro to the very last one, which I think I'll finish off with a
just like the Mario remake I made, I can't release this game either. But if you guys want to watch
double reaction, me reacting to myself reacting.
Alright, see ya.
And then that will have an outro. Alrighty. Peace. See you in the next. Go to the dang playlist.